Nintendo has a history of making and licensing some rather weird peripherals for their game consoles, everything from Rob the Robot to the Densha de Go realistic train controller. And of these many unique and somewhat odd peripherals, of which I've owned quite a few over the years, there's one that always sticks out in my memory as particularly interesting, I guess would be the best word for it. And if you read the title and looked at the thumbnail, I'm sure you already know that I'm talking about the DK Bongos. For those unfamiliar with them, the DK Bongos were a special controller that came bundled with the rhythm game Donkey Konga and its sequels for the Nintendo GameCube. You would use the bongos in place of a traditional controller for these games, with each face corresponding to a different note on the screen or action in a game or minigame. There was also a microphone in the middle of the controller that was used to pick up claps or really any other sound you made for that matter. I personally just hit the bongos on the side because that seems to be the most consistent way of getting the game to actually recognize what you did when you want it to. If you've been a Nintendo fan for a while now, you might be familiar with Nintendo's history of dropping support for a peripheral once they feel it's run its course or it didn't quite reach the numbers they were hoping for. And sadly, the DK Bongos also fell victim to this, with only 4 games ever being released with full bongo support, one of which only ever came out in Japan. However, the DK Bongo series of games sold surprisingly well for what they were. The Donkey Konga trilogy sold around 1.8 million units, and Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, a platform-style game that used the bongos as the main controller, absolutely adore this game by the way, sold around 1.32 million units. That brings us to a grand total of 3.12 million units sold. That's pretty bananas for a couple of rhythm games and a bongo adventure game if you ask me. But I guess Nintendo felt the bongos had run their course and stopped supporting them after Donkey Konga 3 released in March of 2005. However, despite the early cancellation, it seems that unlike a lot of Nintendo's other rather abruptly halted ventures, the DK Bongos are still remembered very vividly by many fans of Nintendo from the good old GameCube days. I know I still remember them all these years later, and I've definitely got a ton of good memories with these bad boys. So, since I had bongos on the brain lately, I figured I'd take a longer and more intensive look at how these things work and how they were designed. First of all, we've got to figure out who was actually responsible for the creation of the DK Bongos, and depending on who you ask, you'll probably hear a different answer. But I did some digging around through a bunch of old Iwata Asks interviews, and I think I found as close to a solid answer as we can get. In the November 8, 2007 Wii Fit edition of Iwata Asks, Iwata interviews a Nintendo hardware engineer by the name of Nagareda Takeshi, best known for his work as the project lead on the Wii Balance Board. In this interview, Iwata asks Nagareda in reference to working on the Wii Balance Board, "Is this the closest you've ever worked with software?" To which Nagareda responds, "No, I was also involved in software development when I was designing the circuitry for the DK Bongos. That was a joint project with Namco. Now, to what degree we cannot be sure, but from this we now know that we owe a fair amount of the internal design work on the DK Bongos to Nagareda Takeshi and maybe some other designers from Namco." Over the years, Namco has released many very similar games to Donkey Konga in the way of their Taiko no Tatsujin series, which has over 25 installments beginning back in 2001. So it's probably fair to say that they had some good insight into how to go about making rhythm games and their accompanying peripherals. But what about the actual conceptualization of the bongos themselves? Where did that come from? Well, as luck would have it, we can get some insight into this from yet another Iwata Asks interview, this time from the Wii Remote edition, which released on September 11th, 2006. In this interview, Iwata asks the then general manager of Nintendo's research and development division, Takeda Genyo, "While you created a special in-house team to develop the Wii controller, you had also put together a small interface team prior to that, hadn't you? Tell us a bit about this." To which Takeda replies, "Well, when developing a games console, a human-machine interface isn't just a necessity, it's an intrinsic part of the whole process. So a number of years ago, I created somewhere between 10 and 20 teams, each consisting of around 3 people. These teams were given free rein to couple a dedicated controller or peripheral with a GameCube title, and then see whether or not the end result was marketable. This project gave rise not only to the Donkey Konga Bongos and the Dancing Stage Mario Mix Action Pad, but to a number of ideas and designs that would find their way into the Wii Remote." So it was from one of these 3-man cells of peripheral pumping people that the DK Bongos were born. We don't know who in particular came up with the idea, but thanks to Iwata, we at least have a general idea of how this honestly pretty out there concept for a controller came to be. And that's just about everything I could find out about the development of the DK Bongos through online sources. It's honestly more than I was expecting to find, but if you know me, you know I'm not going to stop there. I need to know how these things work on a deeper internal level, so I of course broke out the old 4.5mm game-bit driver and went to town on my bongos. From the perspective of someone who's only ever played the DK Bongos, it might seem like they're pretty technically complicated. I mean, they do have stuff like audio recognition and a rather unique method of inputting commands, but honestly, they're really simplistically designed. You might have been expecting to see the bongos filled to the brim with different wires, buttons, and circuit boards, but in reality, they're basically completely hollow on the inside, which actually makes them a pretty great place to store stuff. So if you ever need someplace to stash, say, your bananas or something you don't want the cops to find, like your secret stash of iodized salt, you can always use the good old DK Bongos. But all joking aside, there really isn't too much to talk about on the inside, but that doesn't mean there isn't some interesting stuff going on here. First of all, something I'm sure that not many people are aware of is that the drum faces of the DK Bongos are actually split into two sections, each with its own individual button press. This was denoted by a line on the face of the bongo, but sadly was never utilized in any game that had bongo support. Which is honestly a pretty big shame in my opinion, because I definitely would have liked to see some harder Donkey Konga songs that used where you hit on the drum as a different note. However, even though this feature was never officially used in a game, doesn't mean it hasn't ever been used by anyone. We'll get to that a little bit later. As for how the drums actually work, well, it's pretty simple. They're just really big buttons. Like I said, there are actually 2 buttons per drum, but they work in the exact same way. As you push down on the face of the bongo, you also push down a membrane under the face that has a small piece of conductive material on it. When this piece of material eventually comes into contact with a small circuit board underneath it, this completes a circuit that tells the console you just pressed the button. Pretty simple stuff, right? This is actually the same way most buttons on normal controllers function even today. You can definitely tell that whoever was responsible for the design of the bongos was used to working with gaming controllers. Other than the 2 drum faces, we have a small round microphone which sits right in the middle of the bongos and is connected to the controller's circuit board with 2 wires much like the bongo buttons. The board itself is extremely small, even for a controller, and has only 2 notable chips on it. One large chip, which presumably handles inputs and sends them to the console, and one small chip, which, based on its positioning, may be somehow related to the microphone. The larger of the 2 chips is almost identical to those found in GameCube controllers, which I guess really shouldn't surprise anyone. However, the smaller chip is nowhere to be found on a GameCube controller's board, which is another reason it may be connected to the microphone in some way. And that's pretty much all there is to the DK Bongos internals. Definitely much simpler than I was expecting, but still pretty cool. One thing I found pretty interesting while doing research on the bongos is that depending on what region you live in, they're actually branded as different instruments. In the English-speaking world, they're of course known as bongos, and based on how they look, they really wasn't anything I ever questioned. I saw them and thought bongo, so I just took for granted that that's what they were. However, if you lived in Japan at the time of Donkey Konga's release, you were told a completely different story, one which actually makes a little bit more sense. In Japan, the name of the DK Bongos is the Taru Konga. This is a mashup of 3 words. Taru, which means barrel, controller, and Konga, which is a different type of drum originating from Cuba. Contrary to the small size of the bongos, conga are actually quite large, and as such are played in a completely different manner. Whereas bongos are played predominantly with 1 to 3 fingers, the conga is usually played with the whole hand. It makes a much deeper sound, more akin to what you hear when Donkey Kong plays his drums. Admittedly, the 2 are quite similar, and I'm sure for a lot of you out there, when you see conga, you probably just assume they're also bongos. And I can't blame you, because if I'm being honest, I was the same way before I got deep into the bongo and conga lore while researching for this video. The controller is more akin to what you'd expect to see from a set of bongos, but the name of the game is Donkey Konga, so I'm pretty sure that was the intention here. Obviously, Nintendo wasn't going to sell you a giant set of realistic conga with Donkey Konga, so they shrunk them down to more of a bongo size. However, in a lot of the promotional material and packaging, the drums are more of what you'd expect to see from a conga in their size compared to Donkey Kong. Even in the game, they're a little bit bigger than a typical set of bongos. But I think that's enough musical talk for one video. I know I'm way out of my wheelhouse here, but it was kind of fun to learn more about something I'm not as comfortable with as I am with games. As I said towards the beginning of the video, the games that use the DK Bongos sold over 3 million units total. This means that there are a ton of people out there who still have, or at least at one point owned, a set of the bongos. Now obviously not every game sold came with a set of bongos, so if we divide that number by say 4, one for each game because you only need 1 set of bongos, we'll probably get a more accurate representation of how many sets of DK Bongos are actually out there. So a quick trip to the calculator says that 3.12 million divided by 4 is 780,000 bongos. That's a lot. And since there are so many people out there that own the bongos at one point, combined with the fact that they're just so weird and iconic, the DK Bongos have taken on a new life of sorts post-Donkey Konga. If you do a quick search on YouTube for DK Bongos, you will no doubt be greeted with a myriad of videos featuring the drums being used in games and on consoles they weren't originally intended for. It's become kind of a running joke to push yourself and the bongos to the absolute limit with games like Dark Souls and Mario 64. Now I know what you're thinking, how can you possibly play those types of games on a set of bongos? Well, that's where the extra buttons on the drums come into play. Each drum can actually count as 3 buttons, top button, bottom button, and both at the same time. Pair that with the clap input and the start button, and you've got yourself a grand total of 8 buttons. I know that's still not enough, but it's just enough to be passable in a lot of games. Some people even hook up a few sets of bongos to make even more playstyles possible. It's honestly pretty crazy. As far as I know, in order to do this, you will need some special equipment and maybe even some modding, but it's widespread enough that it can't be that hard if you're really interested in playing Breath of the Wild on the bongos. Well, I guess that wraps up another video. I tried something a little bit different this time, going for more of a focused approach on one thing, rather than a quick look at a wide variety of things, and it was a lot of fun. I was thinking of making this Nintendo and Weird Peripherals video into a series where I look at a bunch of weird stuff from Nintendo. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know and I'll get right on that. And if you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Hack out. Don't tell the cops and I'll give you guys all the salt you want.